Take a large measure of faith, mix it with equal amounts of ability, pour in a generous portion of energy, and season it all with warmth and humor, and you start to get the recipe for Ivan Cumming. As the director of the Naramata Center for Continuing Education, he has influenced the lives of a good number of the church leaders of this province. His skills in working with groups keep him in demand by educators and community organizers right across Canada. He came within an ace of being the moderator of the United Church of Canada, was one of the key personalities in the events celebrating its 50th anniversary, and has been involved in a whole series of festivals of the faith, helping other Christians to tell their story. Tonight on Pressure Point, he tells his story as I talk with my friend Ivan.
There's a difference in you and me. I don't bellyache, you do.
Here we go. This is Ivan Cumming, who you've been seeing talking, and we've been sitting here talking, as we often do, and could go on probably forever. So when we run out of videotape, we'll still be here. And you heard that introduction about Ivan, and I'm privileged to call Ivan my friend. I've been a couple of times in my life, Ivan. I've wanted to talk to you about things that were coming up. And you've just been involved in a thing called Festivals of the Faith.
Right.
What are they? Are they a modern version of the old prayer meeting, or what?
No, I think they're new. I think they're new. They're, well, I don't know. We've had a few of them in the United Church of Canada, and they're springing up all across the church. It's an opportunity for a group of people to come together and hear people tell their own story, and have a chance to tell their own too, in a setting where we can talk and share and do some singing and a lot of things that go with a festival. Like it's really a good celebration.
Like, I can remember one of my first charges, every Wednesday night they had a prayer meeting in which people took turns giving their testimonies. Since there were only 6 people in the prayer group, you sure knew the testimony when time its turn came up again.
Yes.
Is there something of that about it?
Sure, there's something about that in it. I think all of us need to be heard. We need to have somebody hear our story quite a bit. I think as a child, we know children need that. We know that children have a kind of a need to come home and say, look, hey, this is what I've been doing. And if it's a sad thing, they need to talk about it. Or if it's a tough thing, they need to talk about it. Or if they've done something at school that's really exciting, then they need to have a chance to tell it. Now that need doesn't go away. It stays I believe it stays with us. And particularly it stays with us as we get older and as we go through all the passages and crises. So part of it is, yes, we need to have a chance to have somebody hear our story and help us tell it. That's one.
My little guy, who's now 6, at least once a week when he's going to bed, wants to hear the story of how he was born. And you can't short-circuit it. I mean, it's got to start from the time of the labor pains right through, describing, unfortunately, I was there.
Start partway through, yeah.
As my wife reminds people when I tell the story, she was too.
Yeah.
So what's going on there?
I think that Jamie is going to want to keep on doing that to some extent, but he's also going to want to have, I suspect, an opportunity to tell every story of every new birth. Like he'll want to hear about when he started to school and when he started to high school. He may even want to know about when he starts going out with girls, or when he gets married, if he gets married, and all those kinds of things. Mm-hmm. I believe that Jamie is not unlike all of us, that he'll want to have a chance to say something about those important times. And I'm not going to start saying all the reasons why he wants to hear that. I just think that's part of being human. So that's part of what goes on in the Festival of Faith.
Okay, like, how do you choose who's going to tell their story?
Well, there's another element, Rod, and I want to get onto that first. The other thing is that as a church, we understand ourselves as people who have a story to tell, a historic story. Mm-hmm. The people of Israel experiencing God mostly in reflection, saying, when we were walking around the wilderness, other people may have thought we were lost, but looking at it now, we were being led. Mm-hmm. Or crisis and all these kinds of things. The story of God working among his people and giving them life and giving them meaning. Now, that story is relived in each of us to some extent. And for a long time, I think we've been part of the church. We get together and we tell the historic story. But it's important that we also tell our own historic story in relation to that. Mm. So the Festival of Faith then involves not just sitting around telling our story, but what does it mean? And how in fact is that kind of a process of redemption and renewal coming into that? Or how are people living with their struggles?
So do you use a couple of people who are chosen as storytellers to try to spawn other people or spur other people rather look at their own story?
Yes, we choose the people. We had 7, I think, this time. I think it was 7. I know their names, but I don't know their numbers. But to tell stories which were very, very different. And then everybody that came to the festival, and about 220 or so people there, were gathered in groups of 6 people. And whenever they heard a story, they were then encouraged to talk about their own story. So that the action, if it goes well, the action really does center on the people who sit in a circle and tell their story to each other and puzzle about it a little bit. I wonder what that means to me, or saying, isn't it amazing how those incidents in my life are really informing how I approach everything else I do.
And there's been at least 3 or 4 major festivals
Yeah.
and a lot of smaller ones across the country.
Right.
You've been involved in some of them. Seems to be taking place in a denomination like the United Church of Canada, which is very diverse and which is often accused of not really having specific dogma or doctrines. Why do you think in the United Church has this come along, and not, say, in a Lutheran church or an Anglican church?
That's really interesting, and I'm not sure all of the reasons for it. Let me say that I suspect that the United Church is really searching for what one fellow this weekend referred to as a style of operation. And this idea, which came out of some experiences in the United States, could be the sort of indigenous style for the United Church. It gave us a chance to affirm variety, to celebrate something significant when we see it. Here is a person who's 21 years old. She's raised in a farm in Alberta. She went through all the kinds of things about seeing grandparents die and friends die and going to school and being lonely and being successful and choosing a vocation and going to a city and struggling with what it means to be in a new culture, and then down to Vancouver and into UBC and finding a community and all that. See, that's really a miraculous kind of thing. When people do that and kind of come out on top of it and face the issues squarely and come out saying, I'm a person and I know that I'm on a journey here. Well, to get a chance to sit down and say that, that's quite a miracle. And it ought to be celebrated, and, let's just hear it and say something about the Spirit of God that's operating in the everyday lives of people.
Now, you've come a story of your own, as we all have too, eh?
Yeah.
Like, here you are, a person who's, I think, looked upon in the United Church anyway, as one of the really experts in group process and building community. What in your background do you think contributed to that as a prime concern for you?
I've often puzzled about that, but there were times when I got some insights. And once I got some insights from a fellow who was doing a program with us, and we talked about our early childhood. And I realized, I came from a big family, and I realized the first time I ever, pulled myself up over the table and spilt my milk on everybody else's food, first time that ever happened, there were already 7 people there. So I never knew a table that had less than 7 people at it. Like if you had less than 7 people there, then somebody was away, and you were conscious. I was conscious of it. And then a couple of younger brothers came along, so that our normal gathering spot was 11 people. And so, as a kid, I remember some of the struggles of trying to get some kind of control in this. I understand what's going on. All the conversations. I'm sitting there as a little guy, looking up and down the table, and wondering at what point do I get my get my word.
How do I get in?
Yeah, getting my food and getting my words heard and getting the attention of the people who were important to me. Yeah, I'm sure that my understanding of the church as a family, or as the group as a place where we learn to love and learn to fight and learn to settle things and make decisions, I'm sure that has come out of a past that is uniquely my own.
The fighting must have been part of that too, though, eh?
It was, and it wasn't always positively done. A lot of fighting was done by withdrawal, and if I could wish for anything, I would have wished for a better process by which that conflict was handled. Conflict in my family was interpreted as being something naughty, like something that wasn't right, something that had come in from the side. And it took me a while to understand conflict as being not just getting my own way, but dealing with what happens when 2 people come together and there's a shortage of resources, or there's just a difference of opinion. and how important it is. So that's one thing I could have wished for in my background was kind of a more open and more positive way of dealing with conflict.
Because I remember we were talking before the program about an incident we both shared in Saskatoon at General Council when Bruce McLeod was the moderator, and as I recall, a bit of a ring-tangle had gone on in the council, and he raised the question, where's the family?
Yeah.
And you were up there at the microphone doing something and said, what, it's right here.
Yeah, this is the family. Yeah. And then I realized that just came right out of that came right out of my background. You know. And it's easy for me to say that's the way it ought to be, you know, and kind of preach that gospel of the church ought to be this kind of a family and everything. And what's important for me to understand is that's my story. And as my story is how I understand reality. And I can tell you my story and you maybe understand me more. And maybe together we can operate more. But it's not for me to say that's the way everybody ought to see it.
Does everybody have a story, whether or not they can articulate it? In the
I
sense that
believe
there's some
that's
very
true.
formative things that happened?
I think so. And another thing that's really big for me right now is that formative things don't all come out of the past. Like formative things, you know, what I would call formative events that make us different, are events that come to us at points of crisis. Some people talk about them in terms of points of pain. Some people have talked about them in terms of passages. But the folk that I've had contact with, and you know, talking about my experience with group work, some of the people that I had interchanged with in my early days of learning how to work with groups, you know, you're one of them, were able to feed back to me and tell me what I was doing. And in those very critical times, I realized I did a lot of learning. So that formative events, I believe, go on right through till whatever happens to you know, the end of this life.
I sat in an airport terminal one time with about 3 hours to kill, and so as an exercise, I just started spinning back into my childhood to see how much I could remember of events, of not just of events, but of what the living room looked like when I was a kid.
Yeah.
That started to lead on to people who were very important. Can you think back, what kind of people stand out as being very important in your life as a child?
Now, this is really I think it's a worthwhile exercise, and you know, maybe if people are watching this program, they might, when the program's over, just start talking about that with each other. You know, who are the important people? The important people in my life were, you know, brothers and sisters, mom and dad. My older brothers and sisters did a lot of parenting, and I began to understand that I, in some ways, knew my dad more as a grandfather in a sense.
Oh, yeah?
And a great thing happened to me. Talk about learning and changing at the critical times. When our first granddaughter was born, when Lois and Rob had their baby, and at one occasion I took the baby and I sat down in the living room, and when I did it, I felt like my father. And I suddenly realized I'd seen my dad do that with all my nephews and nieces, and with my younger brothers and sisters. And I had an insight about that, gosh, maybe I was more like him than I thought. Well, I like my dad, although there are some traps that I want to avoid if I possibly can. But I'm not avoiding them all that well.
No, we seldom
But
do.
I sat down, and that made me realize how formative my father was, and how formative people with people who were wise, with a sense of humor, a sense of perspective. The people that stand out are people who were often just on the fringes of being rebels. You know, I think the term that was used in the part of the country I came from was there were characters. You know, that was a way to describe.
They appealed to you, eh?
Yes, they did.
Why?
That's the question I don't know. You know, and I don't spend a lot of time with that, except that I know that, you know, one of my uncles who was a person that I think about a lot, and I have to say to myself, well, if I think about him a lot, it must be formative to me. And I realized that this person did a lot of unexpected things. And I suspect I've done some modeling after that, you know.
Modeling after one's father, because I think as you talked, it rang bells with me that I've done that sort of thing too. Does there come a time in every son's life where he has to symbolically take his dad off the pedestal he's had him on?
It was one of the, yeah, I'm sure that's true. And his mother too, that's the whole, a lot of things in that I don't understand all that well, but I know that they're very significant. And I often realized that I was fortunate in that my older brothers and sisters did a lot of parenting. And so my father was able to be an individual a lot more.
He didn't have as many roles to play.
Not as many roles.
Does a father who is trapped in a sort of a smaller family situation, or a mother for that matter, get involved in almost impossibly conflicting roles in your experience? Like you do a lot of marriage enrichment stuff, eh?
Yes, I think so. I think
You've got to
that's
be the
true.
authoritarian figure and the buddy and all the rest of it.
And you know, when people live so long these days, it's not strange to have a person reach 60 and still have their own parents alive, so that they're still living out a role of a son or a child.
Yeah, at 60,
Mhm.
right.
And that does something to our culture. But the important thing, like that spins off from what you're saying to me, Rod, is that if parents could talk to their kids about the roles that they experience themselves having, that is to share some of that, is to say, I'm having a difficult time, you know, trying to be your friend, and also I feel like I need to have some kind of authority, and I don't want to have as much as my father did maybe, but I'm caught in this. If it's possible for parents to talk in those terms with their kids, I think it would be somewhat productive. It would help the children begin to develop models that they can use themselves.
All right, so you grew up in a family where obviously you felt loved and secure and all those good things we all need as a base. What kind of religious upbringing did you get? Like let me just trigger my own. I think I had a lot more involvement with the church building and so on than my kids have gotten. My dad was a pastor, so that would be part of it, and I'm in this job. So I'm here on Sundays in a television studio, and it's hard for my kids to be here and part of that. As you look back on yours, where did you start to get some feeling about faith and God and the church?
It bits and pieces, you know, strange little experiences of prayer when I was in a moment of terror. You know, sometimes I have done something wrong, or my brother and I we were out with a horse and cutter, and we weren't as careful as we should have been. Upset the cutter, and the horse ran away, and you know, I thought the world was going to come to an end. And I remember somehow or other prayer in that setting, you know, when we'd blown it, you know, and you know what was going to happen. Prayer in that setting made sense to me. So obviously there was a lot of that around, that kind of a thought. Having a religious faith was not something you talked about a lot, although my mother did. She talked about it. She's pretty articulate about it. She's articulate about everything she did. And but being Christian involved a lot of things, like honesty, like worship, like sometimes, you know, it looked to me like simply appearing right.
Because you grew up in rural Ontario, didn't
Rural
you? Where
Ontario.
church was a pretty big part of the community life, wasn't it?
Well, in a sense, mine was kind of unique at that, but it was certainly a big part of the family thing. Sunday, for instance, was a great thing. Great day. You didn't work, and you didn't work, as far as my mother was concerned, for specific reasons. You know, they weren't supposed to. That was it. And there were some heavy laws about that.
Yeah.
Now, mind you, I didn't mind it. You know, I didn't mind not working. There were some things I'd rather play and I couldn't do on Sunday, but that wasn't it.
Yeah.
I remember saying to my dad, and this is sort of like my dad was once. So it was when I was home in the summertime. We were working on the farm. We were getting behind in the work, and the weather hadn't been good or something. I said, "Well, I guess we're going to have to start working on Sunday." And he said, "A man's got to be crazy to work 6 days, let alone 7."
You had a much more pragmatic than religious view than your mother.
That's right. I suspect there were some deep religious points of view in that, but they didn't come out so well. It was sort of understood, and that was really it. It was understood, and maybe for us now, there's going to be a challenge for us to get in touch with what I would call a gut theology, a kind of a visceral theology of what are those kinds of values and ideals that are understood for us. They're just part of us. And I believe that our church should help folk get in touch with that.
There's a lot of stuff there that's not identified?
It's not identified, and people don't get a chance to talk about it, or they don't get help to talk about it.
Second and third generation Christians don't really. In the same way that a person who's had a born-again experience can pinpoint that, eh?
Yeah. And it occurs to me that there's a sentence that's coming out of this Festival of Faith that we just finished. Now, I feel so good about having finished it. We've talked about the thing for months and months, and now it's done. But but a sentence came out of there, a fellow that has worked with the committee, and his comment to me was, I've been an elder in the church for 30 years, and this is the first time I ever really had a chance to really get talking about my relationship with God and what that's like. What I interpret to be a very wise, and I like him. I don't know him that well, but he sure was helpful on the committee. But that sentence stays with me because I think that's important. The festivals of faith are one way that we're going to help people articulate some of the deep values and kind of significant decisions they've made, and some people have made them so casually or so often that they don't even realize they're significant anymore.
Can you, in the light of that experience, did you pinpoint points of decision in your own life as you came along? Like you decided to become a minister at some point.
Yeah, I decided that really early before I understood what it meant in many ways. I made it very early in my teens.
Yeah, so did I.
But I remember making some other, I remember one day on the bus coming out of Toronto after some funny meetings that I was really tired of. And I remember thinking to myself, I've got to make a decision here about whether or not I keep on doing what I'm doing or drop it and look some other direction. I was at a point of sensing that my life was turning a corner, and yet the circumstances were not entirely clear to me. Although I was alone, I was somewhat disoriented, and being alone then is a really big thing for me. See, I'm not used to being without people.
Right. Yeah.
I was alone. I was just somewhat disoriented. I was tired. I was a little frustrated at what was going on, and in that bus ride on that day, I remember making a conscious decision that yes, I would need to become even more assertive and more centered on the kind of capacities that I had around adult education work, and I needed to do that for a few years and let the chips fall where they may. And like I remember that day.
How much does one know if that's God somehow calling, speaking, and how much of it is just one's own internal workings out, or does it matter?
Well, I'm more inclined to say it doesn't matter, but then I always interpret it as God. Having said it doesn't matter, then I because it fits so much with the story. Like, see, that's not that different than the biblical story of people, again and again, people needing to make decisions about their future in a situation of disorientation. And
you made the point a while ago, Ivan, that much of the Bible story is hindsight.
yes,
That something happened, they made a decision, and then looked back and said God was in that decision. And if that's the truth of the Bible story, then it does fit with what we just said.
well, I think I wouldn't go so far as to say it's all there, but that's a lot of what happened. I had this fantasy of somebody flying in a helicopter over top of the peninsula after the people of Israel had crossed the Red Sea and trace them where all they went and everything. So, and he'd report back to headquarters, say these people are lost. They know where they're going. Somebody else say they're looking for food or they're looking for shelter or whatever. But they talk about us being led, and somebody else would say led. That's a funny way to be led. All those places that they went. So I think there's a lot of retrospective. And somebody could look at my life and would say, gee, if anybody was leading them, they were certainly kind of erratic. But I want to say and take some kind of responsibility for the fact that I do interpret that as God, and for whatever reasons, I don't know. But it sure seems to me that the sort of mystery in it, the sort of leading that I sense sometimes is taking me places I don't want to go particularly. Other times I sure want to go, but that to me is really part of my story.
They've all involved moments of making decisions. To what extent then are decisions really central to being a human being as made in the image of God?
What comes into my mind right now is the other thing that happens is ecstasy, great time. Something happens that's just great. And that becomes formative. You say, whatever that was, I want to do it again. I think that's like it's part of the response to beauty. It's part of response to sexuality. You know, it's part of the response to warm human encounters. And not so that along with decision is a fact is a feeling that I know I was at home, or I know I was in a relationship, and I want to do that again.
Everything was in place at that
Came
point.
together. You know, the word, you know, he's really got it together. That statement is probably a very important statement. And we heard in the stories this weekend at the Festival of Faith, some people saying, I don't understand it yet, and people saying, I'm really in a struggle, but you know, I somehow sense that I'm together in it. I sense that this has got some meaning to it.
Ivan, we've talked about the festivals. We've only got a moment or two left, so let's go back to them and think now. You've been involved in them at area levels and at regional levels. Where do you see them going as a phenomenon in the life of the Protestant churches in this country?
I think they're reawakening some of our need to be with each other. And I don't know, we do a lot of it at Naramata Center. We do a lot of it. I think it's going to influence the congregational life. I really do. I think that congregations are going to become aware again about how theology is communicated on a person-to-person level. And the biblical insights and the traditional church history, all these kinds of understandings are going to be brought to bear on it.
Almost sounds like a new focus for the life of the congregation. I mean, we've been a social active church, the one that you and I happen to belong to. And this sounds like a new kind of focus that doesn't rule those out, but centers it someplace else.
It affirms those. Yes, I think it is. I think it could be a new focus, a new, and the word that sticks with me out of a conversation this weekend is a new style. A style of relating where we sure value integrity and openness and variety, affirm variety in people's gifts and in people's awareness of God, and keep on looking for evidences of the story. But, you know, look at anything and say, I don't know, maybe that's where it is, maybe it isn't. But it to me, is a lot of curiosity and a lot of excitement, and that needs to be always built in. There's more curiosity and searching than there is statements of fact. This is the way it is. This is the way it happened. But hey, look at, you know, here's something happened to me. What do you think of it?
It encourages some searching.
I think it
obviously,
does.
as it has
Yeah.
for a lot of people. Well, Ivan, thanks for being
Yes,
with us.
it's good.
And thank you for joining us as we've just done an exploration with Ivan Cumming, and do as Ivan said and spend some time thinking about your story with the people you've watched this television program with. We'll see you next week.
Pressure Point is a production of Interchurch Television and is funded by the United, Anglican, Lutheran, Roman Catholic, Presbyterian, and Baptist churches. If you'd like more information about tonight's program topic, or if you have suggestions for future programming, we'd be happy to hear from you. You can contact us at Interchurch Television, 1708 West 16th Avenue, Vancouver, V6J2L9, or phone us at 738-1133.